Hey everyone, it's Clay with David Swenson, the semi-permanent guest host of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I have to tell you, before we get to the Jefferson 101, I think this is 110.
Yes, it is. Yes.
Which is Notes on Virginia Part 2. But I received a 3-page typewritten letter from one of our friends.
Really?
Writing from Spain.
Really?
A 3-page typewritten letter praising us in all sorts of ways.
Really?
Telling us that we are kind of a lifeline of American civics to him, and he lives in a kind of an exile in the old world.
Do you know his name?
Yes. And he says in this letter, this is the part that I find so interesting, there's a P.S. You know what it says? I believe in the barn.
Well, you know, it's begun to mean something more than a physical structure. It means hope for a new enlightenment. That's the way I see it.
You know, I suppose she's now your enemy.
Who's that?
The woman rancher who called into question the barn.
Oh, yeah.
And I told you about her, and that led to you kind of exploded that day about this. But I told her, I think this morning, that I was going to record Jefferson Hours this afternoon. And she said, oh, at the barn?
You know, can we not talk about it anymore?
I know. Doesn't that gall you? We get a letter from Spain.
It's been a great day.
We get a letter from Spain.
Yeah.
And now there's this snothead here in Dakota.
Oh,
like,
hey.
That's true.
Let's not call names.
The snothead is a very polite term.
Let's not call names.
Yeah. Anyway, so this edition of the Jefferson Hour is Notes on the State of Virginia Part 2.
Right.
And we did Part 1 last week.
And we kind of got into the black hole of slavery last week.
Well, you can't help it, because in this great book by Jefferson, there are 2 sustained essays on race and slavery, and it's as if they were written by 2 people at opposite ends of the spectrum.
I think it's really interesting that he wrote this, went to France, had it translated, ended up doing another one, and kept coming back to it. And I think it was, I read like at 1814, finally abandoned any idea of. But it was like he kept coming back to this his whole life.
David, you should see it.
I'm going to edit. I'm going to make it a little bit better. I'm going to change this.
When I take people to Virginia for the Jefferson and Virginia trips, we go to the rare books room at the Alderman Library on the campus of UVA, and they show us one of his copies of this. And it's so great because it's this little octavo. It's a tiny little book. But when he had the most beautiful handwriting in the world, and when he'd find out something later in life, he'd write it out in his handwriting, some little piece of encyclopedic information for 2, 3, 4 paragraphs, and then he would take that piece of paper and fold it ingeniously and then paste it into the margins of the book. So you open up the book to page like 200, and then outfolds this little thing that folds 11 times and becomes a big sheet.
I thought that was at the Massachusetts. That's at UVA?
That's at UVA, and it's so wonderful because his handwriting is perfect. It's pasted precisely into the book. But if ever there was an obsessive-compulsive person, I mean, just think of him thinking, I want to add that, but I won't just put it in, like fold it and stick it in the – no, I'm going to paste it in. And people will be able to – his handwriting is as beautiful as print.
Yeah, it really is.
And as legible. And so it's a wonderful book to look at. So he sends this book to a few choice people, and eventually it gets published. And as we talk about in this program, it became controversial for things that he said about religion, for things that he said about race, for things that he said about the Virginia Constitution. Jefferson couldn't help himself. And whenever you write a book, you're going to reveal, even if you're Jefferson, an enormous amount about yourself and things that he probably would not have wanted to see the eyes of the public.
I don't know if he revealed things about himself that he did, but he stated his positions very clearly. And any time you're involved in politics, that will come back to haunt you at some point.
But you know, David, one of the things we talk about in this show is the natural bridge passage where he says you creep to the parapet and look over, and I got a violent headache.
You read that. That's brilliant.
But imagine if you are Hamilton or Andrew Jackson, a man's man, a really manly man, and you read that Jefferson is getting a violent headache by looking over the edge of a bridge. That's what people found easy to joke about with respect to Jefferson.
Again, how things never change and stay the same. You know, it's
like Donald Trump saying that Jeb Bush lacks energy. It's the same kind of calling into question his virility.
Right.
By way of some sort of sly innuendo. And Jefferson faced this because in this book, he really at times seems to forget that he's writing a book, that there will be readers and not all of them will be generous. And we all do that. I've written
Well, its
this
initial
way.
intent wasn't for general readers.
Right, it was to be a private subscription of gifts that he would give to young, promising men in Virginia so that when they became the leadership class of Virginia, they would have had a chance to read his Enlightenment program for his own state.
So before we get to the program, again, thanks everyone who's responded positively on the new website.
1776 Club.
Yeah, well, that too. If we've made it a lot easier to support the show and get bonus content as well.
We have some new little meditations and some essays and some extra
And more to
content.
come, and more to come.
And we certainly appreciate it. Anyone who wants to join that club is welcome to. And I hope people like the new website. Our young web wizard has done a great job.
Things have changed on delivery mechanisms for the show. Rest assured, everything is there. Everything is available for free. If you do want the ultimate access, you join the club. And I think we're back in Reno now with some of the archives.
You've gone all the way back. You know who I heard from today?
Whom?
Mr. Bill Crystal.
And how is he?
He's in Virginia. He's doing very well. And I told him that he will soon be available again.
Don't tell him that. He might not like it.
Oh, he'll like it.
Will he?
We'll probably get a bill from Bill.
From Bill. Yeah. Anyway, they're there, and we're real excited, and it's mostly excited to continue to grow and offer new things. And boy, is the email inquiries for the
president. So what's next? Let's plant the seed, because we're going to go to 111.
Yes.
And that is Jefferson in France.
My fave.
And you know who can help us with that?
Whom?
Dr. Bruce Pitts.
You know, and he's coming up for some shows.
He's coming in for 2 on his recent trip to Vicenza, the home of Andrea Palladio in northern Italy. But we will also ask him some questions about Jefferson in France, so we can maybe
sort of prelude into it. Yeah,
but
great.
the next 111 will be Jefferson in France, and then 112 will be Jefferson, the Secretary of State.
That's enough to think about today.
So we got 2. If people want to send in questions about Jefferson in France, his European travels, Jefferson and the French Revolution, that's the next one. And then the one after that is when he comes home in 1789 and discovers that he's been named the first Secretary of State and has to shift the whole tenor of his life and has a miserable 3 years being George Washington's first Secretary of State.
Yeah, he wasn't the only one that was miserable, and some people thought he was pretty much nuts.
Well, I don't think he was nuts, but I'll tell you what, he was in the darkest mood of his entire life.
Some people did, though.
Yeah, Hamilton.
Well, you know.
Hamilton and Hamilton.
Off with their heads, that kind of stuff. Is he really that nuts?
Well, you know, he felt strongly about these things.
Okay, then.
All right, so listen now to this out-of-character edition in the Jefferson 101 series. Let us know how you like it. The Thomas Jefferson Hour today, part 2 of Jefferson and his only full book, Notes on the State of Virginia. Thanks for listening. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, brought to you by Bismarck State College on the banks of the Missouri River at the heart of the Lewis and Clark Trail.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with or about President Thomas Jefferson. This week, as we often do, we are going to talk with the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson. I'm your host, David Swenson, and we're here to continue a discussion this week, Clay, that we started last week and kind of knew we couldn't get through it all in one episode, and that is the discussion about Notes on the State of Virginia.
Notes on the State of Virginia, first printed in 1785, first published in 1787, is a sort of accidental book that Jefferson wrote. In other words, he didn't sit down one day and say, I'm going to write a book about Virginia. Instead, he responded to a questionnaire that was sent to him, as it was sent to the governors of all 13 states, by the French legation, the French diplomatic headquarters in Philadelphia, and the secretary of that legation, Francois Barbé Marbois, sent the governors this questionnaire about climate and economics and military life and aborigines and rivers and mountains and seashores and boundaries and so on, 23 separate subjects. And Jefferson, who was a indefatigable collector of data all of his life and one of the most intellectually organized men who ever lived, this was a perfect project for Jefferson. He received this questionnaire, and David, as you know, he received it at a very difficult time in his life. This is when Virginia was overrun during the last period of the war by British troops, including Charlottesville and eventually Monticello, when Jefferson failed as the wartime governor of the Commonwealth of Virginia and resigned sort of in disgrace, certainly in ignominy, in June of 1781, effectively abandoned his post because he should have stayed on at least until somebody could have been elected in his place. Bannister Tarleton and his dragoons attacked Monticello. Jefferson fled into the woods with his wife and young children. Then Jefferson got to Poplar Forest, his second home. The house had not yet been built there, but he was staying in an overseer's house, and during that period he fell from his horse and broke his wrist. So now he's been politically discredited. He's now going to be accused of having been a coward for the rest of his life during the course of the British raids on Charlottesville and Monticello. Now he's physically injured. And in addition to all of that, his wife is very fragile and quite ill. She's been pregnant nearly continuously in the course of their marriage. We know, Jefferson doesn't know at this time, but she will be dead by September 6th, 1782. And so he has this fragile wife to be deeply concerned about. And as far as he's concerned, his public life is over, and it's ended in abject disgrace. He's even being formally investigated by a resolution put forward in the Virginia House of Delegates for misconduct during the course of the British raids on the James River. So Jefferson is at the nadir, or soon to be at the nadir of his life. I suppose you'd say that the nadir of his life came on September 6th, 1782, when his wife died at the age of 33. And Jefferson had effectively a nervous breakdown. But this is a bad period in his life. And yet, when he gets to Poplar Forest, he still has this questionnaire. And he's been collecting data points all of his life, and he has his files with him. And so he sits down at Poplar Forest and writes out the beginnings of what would become this book. And this book, published in 1787 in London, becomes an American classic. It's been called by intellectual historians the most important American book written before the year 1800. And it was effectively an encyclopedia of Greater Virginia, if by Greater Virginia we mean our Virginia, our West Virginia, our Tennessee and Kentucky and Ohio, and really everything up to the Mississippi River, and arguably everything up to the Rocky Mountains, that some gigantic middle swath of the country below Pennsylvania, but sort of fanning out into the Ohio country all the way up to the Great Lakes and all the way west to the Rocky Mountains, south virtually to Texas, that this huge zone with Virginia as its portal, but everything west of it, southwest of it and northwest of it and west of it, all of this is Greater Virginia. And Jefferson writes about this, and his purpose is to vindicate America against its critics in the European intellectual world.
I have to ask you if you agree that this was the most important American book written before 1800.
Yes, I think
you do.
It's the only book that I would put up against it. Well, two really. One is Common Sense, which is really a pamphlet, but a much more influential book, Common Sense by Thomas Paine, and secondly, Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, which became the template for American how-to books and American autobiographies. It's a book of great genius. Jefferson actually played a minor role in getting the third part of Franklin's autobiography into print. But there are rivals certainly for this status as this great work. But what Jefferson did is so typically Jeffersonian. I mean, he took on something of enormous magnitude, a kind of a geography and history and vision of Greater Virginia, if by Greater Virginia we mean essentially America, at least America excluding New England, and that he wrote about technical subjects, where the source of a certain river is, where its mouth is, how wide it is at its mouth, how many tons of navigation can go how deep into the interior of the James or the Potomac or the Appomattox River. He's writing an almanac. If you buy an almanac, they used to be very important. Now they're not so much given the internet. But an almanac is a digest of factual knowledge with a few essays thrown in. That's sort of what Notes on Virginia is. It's an almanac of Greater Virginia, or maybe the first encyclopedia of Virginia, heavily factual in its foundations. But then from time to time in the course of it, Jefferson sort of lights up and writes an essay about slavery, or an essay about magnificent scenery in Virginia, or an essay on freedom of religion, or an essay on race, or an essay on the Constitution of Virginia, or the rights of man, or freedom of the press. The book is 85% factual and, frankly, somewhat tedious to read. And the rest is this magnificent prose poem about Virginia.
To back up, for those of you who are just joining us, you're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Earlier this year, we decided to do something that we've done periodically, but do it in a much grander fashion, and that is what we used to call, at least in-house, the Jefferson 101 series, where we would sort of back up and do short fact-finding biography shows about Jefferson's life. And we thought this year, well, why not do it in a bit more depth? And that's what you're joining now. Is we started with Jefferson 101 and have sort of named the series that. And in fact, we are now up to Jefferson 110, and you're listening to the second part of a discussion on Jefferson's one and only truly published book, Notes on the State of Virginia. Last week, we ended with the first part of our discussion on this book, and it was a long discussion about his feelings on slavery. And as Clay put it so well, that issue is sort of a dark star that the closer you get, the more sucked into it you become. So
we will not go there this week.
Well, actually, we've got another good one up in the list, and that is religion, and his very famous statement, neither picks my pocket or, well, you know the...
So he's
the quote.
writing about freedom of religion, and he is already written the Virginia Statute for Religious Liberty. It's not yet law. It doesn't pass into law until 1786, but he's already written it, and he's very proud of it because, remember, on his deathbed, he wanted to be remembered for three things: the Declaration of Independence, the Virginia Statute for Religious Liberty, and then the University of Virginia. And so of the big three things that he thought were his monumental contributions to humanity, the centerpiece is the Virginia Statute for Religious Liberty. He wrote it in 1777 or so. It was passed into law thanks to Madison in 1786, while Jefferson is actually in France serving as the American minister to the court of Louis XVI. So Jefferson is a free thinker, and in the Virginia Statute he said basically, your mind is utterly free and uncoercible, that government has no right to try to coordinate your thinking on any subject, and particularly on questions of conscience, that government can deliver the mail, government can conscript you for war, government can print money, government can raise taxes, but government can't intrude upon your religious freedom, that's a violation and unenforceable because, of course, what people think is something the government can never get its hand on. And so in the course of that description in Notes on Virginia of all this, he, as Jefferson sometimes did, he sort of gets into a whimsical frame of mind, and he wrote the following sentence, and boy, did this sentence come back to haunt him. He wrote, "The legitimate powers of government extend to such acts only as are injurious to others, but it does me no injury for my neighbor to say there are 20 gods or no God. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg." So if you pick my pocket, I sue you. I have you arrested. If you break my leg, that's battery. But if you believe in the Mormon God or the Jewish Jehovah or the Islamic Allah or Methodism or Lutheranism or Zoroastrianism or the Manitou of the of the Algonquin Indians, "It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg, and therefore is not a public policy question."
It came, as you say, it came back to haunt him, especially in the election of 1800. We need to take just a short break, Clay, but when we come back, I'd like to hear more about how it came back to haunt him.
Indeed, it's one of the most controversial sentences he ever wrote, and I'm guessing he did not think that it would touch off a storm of controversy.
So we'll take a short break, but we'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson. This week's conversation is about President Thomas Jefferson. It's about his Notes on the State of Virginia, considered really the only book he published. And I am joined in discussion by the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson. And we were talking about this, what was called this notorious statement. Could you read that again?
"The legitimate powers of government extend to such acts only as are injurious to others. But it does me no injury for my neighbor to say there are 20 gods or no God. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg."
I have to ask you, we didn't get into this earlier in the conversation, but the book was first published in France, correct?
It was printed in France. He had a couple of hundred copies printed, and he was going to distribute them very carefully to people that he thought were reliable and would not be offended.
But he was very unhappy with, as I understand it, with the translation.
Well, no, that he printed it in English, but then a French publisher got a hold of a copy and hired a French translator to translate it into French. When Jefferson learned this, he was very upset, and then he hired a friend of his, Morellet, Abbé Morellet, who was a French philosophe, a French Enlightenment figure, and Morellet then translated from Jefferson's English into better French. Even so, Jefferson was not pleased, and he realized that it would soon be, if it were published in French, it would soon be picked up by an English printer and then translated from Jefferson's English to French and then back to another English. In other words, the pirated copy would be in a bawdlerized bad translation of an inadequate translation. So,
yeah, now I read that it was common for a publisher or printer to embellish the original text on translation, and Jefferson was very unhappy with it.
Of course, he wanted to control this. So then he authorized an English edition of his own original text, and that was published in 1787. So that became the first English edition published in London, and Jefferson was reasonably happy with it.
But it came back to haunt him in the election of 1800, I guess, was where we left off.
Yes, he had not wanted this book to be published at all because he was afraid of that it contained incendiary material likely to offend, and he was right. And so when he stood for the presidency in 1800, his enemies combed this book, and they made great fun out of his strictures on slavery. We won't go into them, but all of the terrible things he said about the character and physique and mind of Negroes, and they made fun of him in any way they possibly could about all the things that he had said in Notes on Virginia, and they made fun of him about his belief that the mammoth must still be grazing somewhere in the American West, and they just did what they could, opposition research in this book to take things out of context and expose Jefferson as a kind of a brainiac who was not sufficiently grounded in the real world, and a kind of odd utopian, and somebody who was irreligious. And they seized upon this passage especially, but it does me no injury for my neighbor to say there are 20 gods or no God. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. And his critics said, hey, wait a minute. It does pick my pocket, and it does break my leg. It does injury for someone to say there is no God. You cannot have a society in which people renounce God. God and religion are the restraining mechanisms that keep people minimally in line. If we take out that control mechanism, what religion does to restrain human greed and human selfishness, it'll be pandemonium. It'll be a world not worth living in. And here's this philosopher from Virginia who glibly, who almost flippantly writes a paragraph like this. It's not a carefully reasoned and agonizing paragraph in which Jefferson says it's not clear that religion really plays that significant a role, and there are probably other ways in which humans can be restrained. I understand that this is a controversial matter, and I say this with great care. None of that. It's this sort of flippant, humorous language. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg, and people found that to be unnecessarily irreverent and lacking in gravitas, and they believe that he's simply wrong. It does do me an injury if my neighbor says there are 20 gods or there is no God. So don't pretend, Mr. Jefferson, that religion is not the central fact of a society and civilization worth living in. This was published all over the country. Vicious attacks on the man who wrote these words.
There's a little bit off subject, but I can't believe how contemporary that is. We think of, we live in an age where you can go back and find television interviews, and there's all these writings, and you can search and stuff. But even in the election of 1800, they were using previous material of the candidate that they opposed to run him down in the press.
This is opposition research, and they did a brilliant job of it. And
even in 1800,
if you ran for governor of Minnesota today and you said this, the legitimate powers of government extend to such acts only as are injurious to others, but it does me no injury for my neighbor to say there are 20 gods or no God. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. That would be used against you, David, and it would arguably cost you the election.
I always thought it was a pretty good quote and fairly harmless and clever.
It's flippant in the minds of an evangelical of any branch of Christianity, and people still have trouble with Jefferson's flippancy. I think he's a little bit like Sheldon on Big Bang Theory. I don't think he even thought he was being flippant. I think he thought he was being perfectly rational, and that all rational people would agree to this. I certainly do. If you say to me that you are a Jehovah's Witness, or if you say to me that you believe in New Age candle worship, this may affect my feeling about you as a human being, but it doesn't affect my feeling about you as a citizen. And that's what Jefferson is saying. He's saying these are private matters. These are not questions about the state. The state doesn't have a right to get into this zone. These are, in the Declaration he says there are unalienable rights. Well, we know there are alienable rights, and there are unalienable rights. An alienable right is my right to keep all the money in my pocket. If I form a government, we're going to tax some portion of the money in my pocket. That's an alienable right to property. I can alienate my right to unlimited accumulation. We can decide that there's a graduated income tax or there's an inheritance tax. But then there are unalienable rights. These are rights that are inherent in being fully human, and they can't be given away by people, and they can't be taken away by the state. And for Jefferson, our freedom of conscience is a fundamental, don't touch this one, unalienable right That's all he's really saying here, but he says it in a language which enabled his enemies to regard him as an atheist, as a free thinker, as an irreverent man, as an irreligious man, and as an unserious man.
We've talked before about how it's easy to find contradictions in Jefferson's writing.
Right.
And I can't remember how you explained it to me very well, but something about how he was an impulsive. How did you put that?
He's responsive.
Oh, responsive.
He's responsive to this or that moment. And he sometimes says, Madison has this famous statement that he made after Jefferson's death when people were finding these whoppers in Jefferson's writings. And Madison said, you have to understand that in Jefferson, like other geniuses, there is a tendency at times to say something a little more strongly in the enthusiasm of the moment than is strictly speaking reasonable from a broader, longer perspective. In other words, that Jefferson sometimes said something in excess of what he really meant for rhetorical effect because he was stirred up by some circumstance or moment or other.
Well, I was thinking about the quote we talked about earlier about people, that these liberties are a gift of God, that they are not to be violated, but without his wrath. And
I tremble for my country when I flag. First of all, Jefferson did have this capacity to overwrite. There's a certain he's a little bit of a utopian loose cannon, and Madison understood this. And one of my favorite things to think about is the burden of being Madison, of knowing that your friend is one of the greatest men who ever lived and a towering genius and the very basis of a whole political movement, and the author of something as great as the Declaration of Independence, the author of a book as great as Notes on Virginia, a man with an exquisite home, beautiful architectural sense, a perfect sense of interior design. Here's this Da Vinci of America, and yet he's prone to these whoppers. He's prone to writing things that get him in trouble. And then poor Madison, have to follow behind him and clean up after him because he can't chasten himself in his expression quite enough.
Let's move on to his writing. Well, as you said a couple of times, it was a listing of facts and figures about the state of Virginia. But he also had some pretty interesting writings about special places.
There are two immortal passages in Notes on Virginia that are amongst the greatest single passages in American literature, broadly defined. And one is on the confluence of the Shenandoah and the Potomac at Harper's Ferry, and the other one is on the Natural Bridge in Virginia, which is now being obtained by the Virginia Parks system and will become a public place. It's been privately held for a very long time. And let's begin with the Natural Bridge. This is really pretty amazing, and he had to squeeze it in because it didn't really fit. There's no in the 23 subjects that the Secretary of the French legation sent around. None of them said natural bridge or geologic feature. The closest he could come to was cavern. And so Jefferson is going to wedge this in because he wants it. He so loves it. So let me just read it to you. The Natural Bridge, the most sublime of nature's works, though not comprehended under the present head. In other words, it doesn't really belong in a chapter on caverns. The Natural Bridge, the most sublime of nature's works, though not comprehended under the present head, must not be pretermitted. It is on the ascent of a hill, which seems to have been cloven through its entire length by some great convulsion. The fissure just at the bridge is, by some admeasurements, 270 feet deep, by others only 205. It is about 45 feet wide at the bottom and 90 feet at the top. This, of course, determines the length of the bridge and its height from the water. Its breadth in the middle is about 60 feet, but more at the ends, and the thickness of the mass at the summit of the arch is about 40 feet. A part of this thickness is constituted by a coat of earth which gives growth to many large trees. The residue, with the hill on both sides, is one solid rock of limestone. The arch approaches the semi-elliptical form, but the larger axis of the ellipsis, which would be the chord of the arch, is many times longer than the transverse. All right, so far it's all science, right? It's 18th century general descriptive science in an age before photography. So this is as accurate a description as he possibly could provide. But now watch what happens. Though the sides of this bridge are provided in some parts with a parapet of fixed rocks, yet few men have resolution to walk to them and look over into the abyss. You involuntarily fall on your hands and feet, creep to the parapet, and peep over it. Looking down from the height, about a minute gave me a violent headache. If the view from the top be painful and intolerable, that from below is delightful in an equal extreme. It is impossible for the emotions arising from the sublime to be felt beyond what they are here, so beautiful an arch, so elevated, so light, and springing, as it were, up to heaven. The rapture of the spectator is really indescribable. Isn't that beautiful?
It is.
So you start with science. He gives you an accurate description of the place, and then he goes into this poetic reverie that he had, that when you get to the top of this arch, even though there's kind of a protective natural wall, you involuntarily get on your hands and knees because you're scared. And then he said, looking down, even for a minute, gave me a violent headache. It's impossible for the emotions arising from the sublime to be felt beyond what they are here. This extremely romantic account and a confessional. He says he was up there, scared to death, got a violent headache, couldn't even believe how overwhelming it was. But then listen what happens. After the rapture of the spectator is really indescribable. He goes on. The fissure, continuing narrow, deep, and straight for a considerable distance above and below the bridge, opens a short but very pleasing view of the North Mountain on one side and the Blue Ridge on the other. At the distance each of them of about 5 miles, this bridge is in the county of Rockbridge, to which it is given name, and affords a public and commodious passage over a valley which cannot be crossed elsewhere for a considerable distance. The stream passing under it is called Cedar Creek. It is a water of the James River, blah, blah, blah. So he starts scientifically, then he allows himself this moment of poetic rapture and romanticism, and then it's as if he catches himself, David, and says, well, I better get back down to the prosaic here. The fissure continues narrow and deep. It's pleasing. It's part of the James River estuary. It's the only way across this chasm for a number of miles. It's as if he's embarrassed by how he let himself go there for a moment.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how he was personally captured by this. Now, I know from reading that at one time he actually tried to sell it during a difficult financial period, but he changed on that and decided never to sell it, to hold on to it forever.
He bought it relatively early in his life. The first time he saw it, he just fell in love with it. And if you've ever been to Arches National Park in Utah, there's where real arches are. They'd make this one look like a puny little thing. But for Virginia at the time, it was magnificent. It's still pretty good. Even now, I've been there, I suppose, 20 times in the course of my life, and I can't wait until the state makes it more primitive and fundamental from the kind of commercialized thing that it had become.
And that's underway. I know
it's happening now. We've had correspondence with these folks,
right,
and we want them on this program. I want to come to the Natural Bridge and lecture about it one of these days. But at any rate, Jefferson loved it, and he was always telling Maria Cosway or somebody else it's worth a trip across the Atlantic to come and see it. You know, you can't let your life go by without putting this on your bucket list. You have to come and see this incredible thing. So he bought it, and he took people out there. And people he couldn't take out there, he gave directions on how to reach it, and he kept it. And even in times of economic difficulty, he found a way to keep it because he didn't want it to be commercially exploited, which, alas, it later was. And he wanted it to be a kind of it was like the first national park, privately owned. But Jefferson wanted it to be a place where you could go and you would see nature in its most sublime aspect, and it would be as little touched by human development as possible, so that people could always experience in this part of Virginia something of the primordial magnificence of the New World this effectively becomes the basis of the national park idea.
In conversations with President Jefferson, he has said that they could never imagine running out of special places and natural resources, but he wrote something about it being in public trust and would on no consideration permit the bridge to be injured, defaced, or masked from public view. That's pretty forward thinking during that time. I understand why you reference the beginning of the national park system, because really, at its heart, that's what it was.
That's what he's doing. There was no government that could have done this in his time, so he decides to make a conservation buy to protect it from adverse economic development, assuming at some point there would be some sort of a national infrastructure that could absorb a park or a place of sublimity. It's the very basis of our parks, of Arches, of Canyonlands, of Devil's Tower, of the Grand Canyon, of Mount Rainier, of Glacier. You know, the most sublime places in North America we have fenced off and protected against economic development so that they will always be symbols of the sublimity of the North American wilderness. And Jefferson begins it in the 1780s.
We need to take just a short break, and we'll continue this conversation in just a moment. You are listening to The Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson. Our weekly conversation this week is with the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson. I'm your host, David Swenson, and we're talking about Notes on the State of Virginia, the second of two shows on this subject. And Clay, where we ended was this beautiful passage that Jefferson wrote. As you said, he sort of snuck it into Notes on the State of Virginia about the natural bridge. And you also mentioned a confluence of the Shenandoah and Potomac River.
That's another one. So, you know, in last week's show, we talked about his famous outcry against slavery. And we've today looked at his passage about religious freedom, in which he sort of says more than is strictly speaking wise for a political figure. And then there's that reverie about the natural bridge. No one, I suppose, would blame him for that, but I'm sure he was ridiculed for it. And his interest in woolly mammoths and mountains of pure salt in the West and so on allowed all of his friends and certainly his enemies to make him a kind of a comic figure, that he was credulous and was sort of over enamored of the folklore of the interior of the continent. This is why I think this book is so valuable. In a sense, it's an inadvertent confessional, pretending to be a dry almanac. But his friends found it out, and his enemies certainly did, and they really pummeled him. And before I go on, I don't want to get stuck in slavery, but he sent a copy to Dr. Richard Price, a good friend of his in England, and Price was, among many other things, an ardent abolitionist. And Price wrote back to him and said, if you believe that, then we've got to do something. Virginia cannot any longer continue to maintain a slave system that you, above all people, know that this will destroy the virtue of the American Revolution and Virginia's place in it. And Jefferson then became very edgy and pulled back because he didn't like even his closest friends to remind him of the terrible inconsistency of American slavery in a land that was created by the Declaration of Independence. So this book got him into some trouble, not only with his adversaries, but to a certain degree, even with his friends. So the other really wonderful passage is about Harper's Ferry. And Harper's Ferry is in West Virginia now. It was in Virginia then, and it's where the Shenandoah and the Potomac come together. And Jefferson, who's sort of just living in the first age of serious geology, kind of intuits something about the nature of geomorphology, about how dynamic forces change natural settings over time. And so let me just read it to you. So it's a little bit long, but it's so beautiful. It's in Chapter 4 on mountains. The passage of the Potomac through the Blue Ridge is perhaps one of the most stupendous scenes in nature. You stand on a very high point of land. On your right comes up the Shenandoah, having ranged along the foot of the mountain 100 miles to seek a vent. On your left approaches the Potomac in quest of a passage also. In the moment of their junction, they rush together against the mountain, rend it asunder, and pass off to the sea. The first glance of this scene hurries our senses into the opinion that this earth has been created in time, that the mountains were formed first, that the rivers began to flow afterwards, that in this place particularly they have been dammed up by the Blue Ridge of mountains and have formed an ocean which filled the whole valley, that continuing to rise they have at length broken over at this spot and have torn the mountain down from its summit to its base, the piles of rock on each hand, but particularly on the Shenandoah, the evident marks of their disrupture and avulsion from the beds by the most powerful agents of nature, corroborate the impression. But the distant finishing, which nature has given to the picture, is of a very different character. It is a true contrast to the foreground. It is as placid and delightful as that is wild and tremendous. For the mountain being cloven asunder, she presents to your eye through the cleft a small catch of smooth blue horizon at an infinite distance in the plain country, inviting you, as it were, from the riot and tumult roaring around, to pass through the breach and participate of the calm below. Here the eye ultimately composes itself, and that way too the road happens actually to lead. You cross the Potomac above the juncture, pass along its side through the base of the mountain for 3 miles, its terrible precipices hanging in fragments over you, and within about 20 miles reach Fredericktown and the fine country round that. Now listen, David, this scene is worth a voyage across the Atlantic. So again, that beautiful romantic description of how these two rivers come together there. They're dammed in by the Blue Ridge Mountains, but over time they tear down those mountains and find a savage passage to the sea, but then to redeem it, because Jefferson's God is a gentle God. At the end of this scene, the river then calms out, and you look off to the far distance on the east, and you see a placid Potomac moving towards the Chesapeake, and all is well again, and God's orderliness has been reasserted. And after allowing himself this reverie of this moment, then Jefferson says, here the eye ultimately composes itself. And that too, by the way, the road actually happens to lead. This scene is worth a voyage across the Atlantic.
I love the line that he describes them as monuments of a war between rivers and mountains, which must have shaken the earth to its center.
Yeah, it's a wonderful passage. It used to be sort of required memorization for people in forensics. And there's a story about this that I just love. So Jefferson actually sat on a rock at Harper's Ferry and either wrote this or drank it in so that he could write this at another time. So this isn't something he just read about. This is something that he saw. And later in life, the rock that he sat on became sort of well known. It's still called Jeffersons Rock to this day.
Really?
And when you go to Harper's Ferry, you can scramble up to Jefferson's viewpoint, his perspective, and look at this scene. But here's the fun part about it. He had so many enemies. During his life, part of this rock disappeared. It must have fallen into the river or something. And when Jefferson was asked about this, he said, well, it was clear that his political enemies had destroyed it. But of course he was joking. but if you look it up in an encyclopedia or Wikipedia, just look up Jefferson's Rock.
I will.
And this place still exists, and there's signage there. You can scramble up and look down at these two rivers. And when we see it, it says something about how jaded we are. You would not quite write this passage about it any longer. We've seen the American West And anyone who has seen the American West looks upon these wonders on the eastern seaboard as relatively impoverished compared to, say, what you can see in Canyonlands National Park or in Zion or Bryce Canyon or Mount Whitney and the Sierra Nevada. So, this is before John Muir, before Meriwether Lewis. And if Jefferson had lived to see some of the things that Lewis and Clark saw, imagine the poetic reveries that he would have found himself in.
I have to ask you about this because I think maybe you can help me. You can shed some light on this. I read it that Jefferson received oil paintings of these two wonders, the Natural Bridge and Harper's Ferry. I'm assuming those two, and also 2 copies of an engraving of the Natural Bridge from an artist by the name of William Roberts. And it said that the paintings hung in Monticello's dining room. Well, I read that neither the oil paintings nor Jefferson's copies of the engravings are located.
Well, there is one. Maybe it's a reproduction, but there is at Monticello a picture of the Natural Bridge, and there is a famous image of Jefferson painted at the Natural Bridge. You can Google it, but it's a picture of him. He's standing with a walking stick, and he's in the foreground, and behind him is the Natural Bridge, and it's a really wonderful painting. He went there so many times, and there were a couple of instances where he just couldn't go for one reason or another, and then he would provide extremely detailed descriptions on how to get there because he wanted everyone who agreed with him about these things to go see it for themselves.
I'm just curious to know if those were ever located or if they're hanging in somebody's room and they don't even know it, or if they were destroyed or lost.
I really don't know the answer to this question, but I do know
that's a tough one to pop on you like that.
But you should look up the famous painting of Jefferson himself at the Natural Bridge, and you can see the pride. I mean, it's like you could put on it as a label, father of the National Park System of the United States, Thomas Jefferson. But I think it's so forward-thinking that he realized that in the course of American history, it would be in our collective interest to take social responsibility to protect certain places of our landscape that are unique to America. There's nothing like Yellowstone in Europe. There's nothing like the Natural Bridge in England.
Or the Badlands of North Dakota.
Indeed, and in fact.
Yeah. I also read, and maybe you can help me with this one, that he took a trip there with his grandchildren in 1817.
Yes.
He would have been, how old would he have been?
Well, let's see. He dies in 1826 at the age of 83, so 17, that's 8 years, isn't it? 7 and 8 is 15, that's 6 years. So he's going to be 77.
An elderly guy,
70,
but
yeah.
he took 2 of his grandchildren. Do you know this story?
Yes, he always went to Poplar Forest for a couple of extended trips per year.
Even in his old age?
This was just about the end of it, until he became too fragile. And he would always take a couple of his granddaughters, and they loved it because what did they get at Poplar Forest? They got Grandpa. No visitors. No.
All to themselves.
And so these girls, they were both reader nerds, and he took them, and he had his library, and then he had his routines, and of course he knew everything about nature, and he was, a famous grandfather, one of the most famous men ever. And these girls just adored him, and they would go, and they would get exclusive time with Grandpa at Poplar Forest, and the conditions were bad, the food wasn't great, the accommodations on the way were awful, but they just begged to be the ones that got to go with him. And so he took them. I can't remember which granddaughters they are, but I think Ellen is usually in this mix. He took them and then said, "This is worth a trip across the Atlantic to see." It's just so great. He had told Mrs. Cosway in the famous Head and Heart letter that it was worth her making a trip to the New World to paint the confluence of the Shenandoah and the Potomac and to paint the Natural Bridge.
So in the time we have left for this conversation, the one other thing that we haven't really talked about are his concerns over the chapter on the Constitution of Virginia. Is that right?
Right. So he found fault with the Constitution. It turns out this was less problematic and controversial than he had anticipated. But what happened was, just to put it in a nutshell, is that when the Revolution began, every state now had to write a new constitution. And so this became a very serious business, 13 states writing 13 new small R Republican constitutions. And John Adams had played a role in this. He had written an endless treatise on constitutions, and it sort of became the template or the formula for the state constitutional conventions. And Jefferson was upwriting the Declaration of Independence, which he didn't particularly want to write. And he knew that back in his own Commonwealth, they were writing a new constitution for Virginia, and he regarded that as much, much, much more interesting and important than the national business that he was up to. So he misunderstood that the Declaration of Independence would make him an incredibly famous and important man, and that the Constitution of Virginia at that time was in a sense neither here nor there. But he wanted so much to be part of it, and he wrote his own, as usual. He sat in Philadelphia and wrote out his own draft Constitution for Virginia, but he couldn't get it there, and by the time it got there, they had already basically done. But they did take part of his Constitution and use it as a preface to the Virginia Constitution, so he felt some little vindication there. But his draft, for example, would have given 50 acres to every man in Virginia so that he would have a land base, and it argued against property qualifications for voting, and it argued against the perpetuation of slavery. And anyway, he thought that this radical document was too liberal, to use our term, for the establishment figures back in Virginia, and that his criticism of what they had done, I mean, he in Notes on Virginia, he's pretty critical of the Constitution that was actually adopted. He thought that this would hurt him politically in his own state. But in the end, that part of Notes does not seem to have gotten much in his way.
But that his rough draft exists.
Yes.
And I have not read. Have you read it?
By our standards, it's a conservative constitution, but it's more progressive than the one that was adopted. The interesting thing is, I mean, to look at this from a sort of a macro historical point of view, suddenly with the Declaration of Independence, these 13 colonies are thrown into what's called a state of nature. They're basically now collapsed into anarchy. There's no authority. And so each state now has to create its own constitutional system. People hadn't thought about this. I mean, they weren't prepared for this. They hadn't studied the ground. That's why John Adams' enormous treatise becomes so important, because he's the only one who's really writing in any systematic way about this, and he therefore was deeply influential. He actually wrote much of the Massachusetts Constitution, and his writings helped to inspire those in many other states. But because these post-colonials had never really had to think about this before, they didn't really know what to do, and they produced some pretty weak and half-hearted and still sort of late colonial or post-colonial sorts of documents. And Jefferson was for, of course, a clean sweep, wipe the slate clean and create a utopian society.
And abolish slavery. That was part of it, wasn't it?
And so he wanted to have in the Constitution some stricture that would eliminate slavery either immediately or within a generation or two. And he knew that that was going to be a controversial suggestion coming from a Virginian, a state that was deeply dependent upon slavery for its economic life, and quite complacent the state was, too, about slavery. And so Jefferson fretted about these things. And so he has it privately printed, and then there's a French ghost edition. He fears an English translation of the French ghost edition, so he authorizes an English translation. He still hopes to keep the lid on this, and he sends some of his copies off to the other James Madison, the Reverend James Madison, the president of William and Mary, and says, if you distribute these amongst the students here, they might become the leaders of the next generation in Virginia. That's where these changes are likely to come about. And what he anticipated as a very private and sometimes secretive man was that his enemies would get a hold of this and they would use this book against them. That's exactly what they did. And even today, people who want to dismiss Jefferson go straight to the passage on black anthropology and Notes on Virginia to condemn him outright.
And so ends our discussion on Notes. On
people should read it.
Virginia.
It's not.
Right.
It's tedious in places, but it's worth reading.
And I just want to encourage folks: if you're a listener to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, go to jeffersonhour.com. It's very easy to click on Ask Jefferson a Question. We love to get listener questions, and we read every one of them. And also, if you'd care to support the show, you can do that there by joining the 1776 Club. So thanks for that.
In 1801, Caleb Boyle produced that painting of Jefferson standing in front of the Natural Bridge. It's worth looking at. We'll post it on our site. We'll see you next week for another exciting edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public Radio. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any past show for a $12 donation, please call 888-828-2853. Again, that number is 888-828-2853. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.org and on iTunes. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.org. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Music by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson.